I have something really cool to bring to you all today, a service I think many of you will all find useful, that being Shortform, an online guide to nonfiction texts and articles, of which some that have been featured on this channel, from thinkers such as Rousseau and Max Weber. I personally just used Shortform to refresh my reading of Rawls's theory of justice, and no joke, really found it to exceed my expectations. I am truly not just saying that. Shortform offers these guides through reading, or by listening through an audiobook or podcast-like format. It's really quite an impressive package for the money, and I'll personally be using Shortform in the future when researching videos. To top it off, Shortform is offering a 5-day free trial along with 20% off for those who sign up with my link in the description below. As 21st century subjects, as people, what might we describe as the social fabric of today? Or rather, how can we describe it? I think for many, we might say heavy consumerism amidst anti-consumerism, phenomena popping up such as minimalism as a product, free live service video games that are simultaneously expensive. From an interpersonal level, the democratic emphasis of well-being for others, despite their race, their sexuality, their religion, but with the very specific requirement that you produce. Relationship within deeply corporate form, essentially the social dynamics of a giant HR department. Insincerity masked by sincerity. While certainly these types of interaction aren't exactly new, I think this is becoming a very common way in which we are parsing our surface interaction with others in the 21st century. And the 21st century is an incredibly interesting time to be analyzing Foucault, particularly his text, Discipline, and Punish. We've talked a ton about contemporary cultural theory on here, yet surprisingly enough, we haven't dedicated a video to Foucault. I'm starting with some examples here in the present, as I'd argue that this is arguably Foucault's most prophetic work. Authored in the 70s, I personally find it quite uncanny how well Foucault was able to recognize a trajectory for how interaction and social order is being conducted. And that's the focus here, order. And not just order, the reinforcing essence, that being power, how power manifests, its systemic techniques, and how we are embedded into a type of unidimensional, carceral, and punitive fabric. But a fabric that might be a lot worse than what we imagine. In order to get into the root of this, we need to start from the 18th century. Foucault highlights the historical context of punishment and its relation to establishing a type of order. Often this is what we think of when we envision punishment. In the first chapter, he highlights the title of The Body of the Condemned and the Spectacle of the Scaffold, the public execution of Robert Francois Damiens, sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly, in the year 1757 by dismemberment, a man who sought to assassinate King Louis XV. The use of public execution, torture, slavery, and even the visual of prisoners was always in the public eye. But the execution of Damiens was just about the most definitive example of this type of punishment. The visual is the important thing here for power, but it extends past brutality into physicality, doing things such as public works, as picking up trash. They often had distinguished appearance as prisoners by their clothing and bald heads. Punishment was served as spectacle. The result is twofold. In a type of Nietzschean spirit, people get to experience a brutal type of justice that invigorates them. The second is the regulatory function of not wanting to be on the receiving end of this. Foucault states,
"The body of the condemned man, the body that is tortured, cut into pieces, broken on the wheel, quartered, hanged, exposed, dead or alive, is the place where the vengeance of the sovereign is applied."
Body is important. That is the very medium in which this type of punishment exists. Matter of fact, Foucault argues that this domain was the primary medium a sovereign, a king, a central power was concerned about. Bodies are tactile, they are physical, they bruise, they reflect on power in the most visual manner possible. This all seems like common sense. This, in many ways, is still the logic many think of when contending with our own system. In essence, the standard logic is that we need to see punishment as visual deterrent to reinforce normative types of behavior. But Foucault thinks different, and this difference started with the death of public executions. To Foucault, this served as a gateway for the trajectory of punishment today. But we see how visceral and quite awful execution and death is. The historical logic so far has been that we've done away with the barbarity. We've embraced a more humane function of punishment. We've enabled human rights. Well, Foucault doesn't really think so. Matter of fact, the horror of this may be that our current system is worse. Foucault contrasts the historically former spectacle of punishment with
a utopia of judicial reticence. Take away life, but prevent the patient from feeling it. Deprive the prisoner of all rights, but do not inflict pain. Impose penalties free of all pain.
Foucault describes the type of public execution seen in history as a type of utilitarian mercy. The punishment is the end result, not the process therein. This is where stuff flips. This flip starts with the birth of the prison. From the progression of modernity, we sought ways to more humanely dole out punishment and deter lawless behavior. But that's only half the equation here. Power saw the spectacle of execution as a potential threat to its existence. Foucault states,
people were summoned as spectators. They were assembled to observe public exhibitions and amende honorable. Pillories, gallows, and scaffolds were erected in public squares or by the roadside. Sometimes the corpses of the executed persons were displayed for several days near the scenes of their crimes. Not only must the people know, they must see with their own eyes, because they must be made to be afraid, but also because they must be the witnesses, the guarantors of the punishment, and because they must, to a certain extent, take part in it.
There's two things here. In order for an execution to work, the people must be present. This bears witness to the brutality of a king, which, while the point, also highlights how easy the person executed could be them, for reasons that may not be truthful nor their fault. The second is that it ironically empowers the spectator. They understand that in order for execution to work, they must be there. That, in some sense, a sovereign's existence is fundamentally tied to them. That if we're required for sovereign power to circulate, then in theory, we also hold a type of power. The historical narrative to the death of the public execution is that we merely progressed past public barbarity into a more civilized manner of conducting punishment. But as we will see, it's not quite that simple. We've now entered the prison, and as Foucault describes in Part 2, the gentle way in punishment. And the gentle way is a much more powerful phenomenon. It's this phenomenon, the prison, that marks a shape in disciplinary power that we experience today, despite fundamental status of a king or rules invoking punishment. Power isn't held in the same overtly authoritative manner, but something internal and deeply psychological, something that regulates the very inner workings of yourself.
The apparatus of corrective penalties acts in a quite different way. The point of application of the penalty is not the representation, but the body, time, everyday gestures, and activities. The soul, too, but insofar as it is the seat of habits. The body and soul as principles of behavior form the element that is now proposed for punitive intervention.
It's important to point out here that up to this point, Foucault is discussing punishment, the birth of the prison, to describe a logic that has infested every fiber of our being. The consequence of regulation does not exist in isolation, and with centuries of punitive development, at this point, a sovereign power, a king, a ruler, your boss, whoever, doesn't need to impose discipline in a traditional manner to Foucault. The result here is that we, as 20th and 21st century subjects, exist as Foucault calls it, docile bodies. We'll get more into this, but in order to explain this, we need to understand how we got here, primarily through Foucault's theory of Panopticism. Foucault uses the panopticon as a metaphor for how society creates the system of regulation we adhere to. But we need to understand what a panopticon is. There was always dark ways in which humans have tried to create more efficient prison, but arguably the most efficient for the time, and what Foucault thinks serves as the best representation, is Jeremy Bentham's late 18th century panopticon design. The panopticon prison works by having cells shaped in a circle with each cell facing a central watchtower, where a watchman could observe the entire lives of prisoners, and yet the prisoners could not see when the watchman was watching. The result and core philosophy of this was that prisoners would be more eager to regulate themselves. At absolutely any moment, the watchman could be watching. Thus, there is no real privacy. You, in a sense, are stripped of being human. You are now a docile body, if you will. This overarching force he labels as the disciplinary gaze.
But the disciplinary gaze did, in fact, need relays. The pyramid was able to fulfill, more efficiently than the circle, two requirements: to be complete enough to form an uninterrupted network, consequently the possibility of multiplying its levels, and of distributing them over the entire surface to be supervised, and yet to be discrete enough not to weigh down with an inert mass on the activity to be disciplined, and not to act as a brake or an obstacle to it. To be integrated into the disciplinary mechanism as a function that increases its possible effects. It had to be broken down into smaller elements, but in order to increase its productive function, specify the surveillance, and make it functional.
There are an absolute ton of examples we can come up with. In the 20th century, the concept of middle management, the form of education, which is built off of hierarchical industrial ideals of production. In a more contemporary context, something that Foucault didn't get to witness in the same way, the entire surveillance apparatus we see. Through history, the panopticon seems to become more and more invasive, but smaller in its form. Instead of a central tower, surveillance is decentralized across devices, security cameras, departments. It's here that we understand that at any moment, we are being marked. More than ever, to Foucault, civil society embodies incarceration before the fact. Disciplinary logic is found within every network needed for society to function. It's not even necessarily the visual of surveillance, but the logic embodied in social services, necessary places we see as a benefit to public good and health, such as hospitals and schools.
We are in the society of the teacher-judge, the doctor-judge, the educator-judge, the social worker-judge. It is on them that the universal reign of the normative is based, and each individual, wherever he may find himself, subjects to it his body, his gestures, his behavior, his aptitudes, his achievements. The carceral network, in its compact or disseminated forms, with its systems of insertion, distribution, surveillance, observation, has been the greatest support in modern society of the normalizing power.
It's important to see that it's not just authoritarian systems where power is executed from a centralized cabal of businessmen and politicians, albeit that dynamic plays a large role, but the execution comes from us, from citizens, normal people. We spoke about the social sentiment of a lot of stuff feeling like a giant HR department. That's the point. Human resources is the most picturesque ideal of contemporary disciplinary power.
This is where you have not met Cloudflare expectations for performance. We've decided to part ways with you.
I know you guys must not be able to understand that given in the positions that you are in, and it must be very easy for you to just have these little 10-minute, 15-minute meetings, tell someone that they're fired, completely wreck their whole life, and then that's it with no explanation.
I can absolutely understand how you feel that way, why you feel that way. And I'll be honest with you, there's nothing that we're going to say in this call and the time that we have that's going to undo the way that you feel right in this moment.
Power cannot show its hand too much. It inherently needs to manipulate, to covertly exercise itself. This is an overarching theme we often find with critical theory and how we can analyze the modern state. In many ways, what we see as authoritarian is through the lens of overt dictatorship, strong men who impose anti-democratic order. But in a sense, isn't the ability to give the appearance of freedom much more effective at control? That things like human rights, civil liberties, are able to execute the very things they supposedly stand against in the most effective manner. This conundrum reminds me of Herbert Marcuse's use of democratic unfreedom when describing the West. And in the case of disciplinary society, the often disenfranchised executing the will of power. It's a dark thing to contend with that the legitimacy of disciplinary punishment is often validated by the majority punished, but in another sense, I think this bears another element of the ironic political agency we may possess. In order for a disciplinary society to operate, we technically have to operate within it. There's a permanent leverage we all contain. Yet much of critical theory after talks about how resistance of power and authority becomes subsumed within it. But being able to find fissures in existing power relations that grant common people some inlook into their agency is a good thing in my mind. I find a lot of this in Foucault's work. It's very similar to the end result of Hegel's idea of the master and slave dialectic, where through the process, the slave holds a type of momentum. We'll be sure to take a look more at Foucault's other body of work at a different date, but the one constant I see is that while his work shows us the various ways philosophical history moves and the use of power evolves such that it represses, in a very similar light, it shows the hidden agency we all contain. Thank you all so much for making it to the end. As per usual, I couldn't do this without the support for all who sign up on Patreon. If you want to get early access, grant some extra content, and ensure the survival of the channel, please do consider signing up on Patreon. There's some extra special patrons I want to shout out, that being Jay Roberts, Kate, and Kevin Hoop. I truly couldn't do this without you all. You have gone above and beyond, and it means the world. Thanks so much for entrusting me to make these videos. For everyone else, I will see you in the next.